If God created everything, then who created God? It's one of the most common questions people ask when they hear about a creator. And for many atheists, this seems like a final nail in the coffin of belief. It's presented as a knockout argument, a clever way of turning the idea of God against itself. But is it really a valid question? Or are we misunderstanding something fundamental? Let's take a deeper look. The first thing to understand is this: not every question is meaningful just because it's grammatically correct. If I ask you, how much does the color blue weigh? That's a perfectly formed sentence, but it's a meaningless question. Why? Because weight is a property of physical objects, not colors. The question is based on a category error. It tries to apply one kind of thing to another in a way that makes no sense. In the same way, asking, who created God, assumes that God is something that needs a creator. But that's not what God is in classical theism. Whether we look at Islamic theology, Christian theology, or even the philosophical arguments for a first cause, the idea of God is not just some big, powerful being in the sky. God is not like Thor or Zeus or Superman. Those are all created beings. The God we're talking about is the uncaused cause, the necessary being who doesn't need a cause, because he is the foundation of all existence. Think about this. In the material world, everything we see has a cause. A tree comes from a seed. A child comes from parents. A car comes from a factory. Our entire experience tells us that things come from something else. But this chain of causes cannot go back forever. Why? Because an infinite regress of causes would mean that nothing ever actually begins. Imagine a line of dominoes, each one falling because the previous one pushed it. But if there was no first domino to start the chain, would any of them fall? Of course not. So there must be something that starts the chain, something that doesn't need to be caused. That something is what we call God. Now let's ask another question. Can science explain everything? Atheists often say, we don't need God anymore. Science explains the universe. But science only explains how things happen, not why there is something rather than nothing. Science describes laws, like gravity, thermodynamics, or motion, but it doesn't explain where those laws came from or why they exist at all. Let's take the law of gravity. It explains how objects attract each other, but the law itself doesn't do anything. It's not a magical force. It's a description of how things behave. It doesn't create anything. It doesn't cause an apple to fall from a tree. It just tells us what will happen if the apple is there and if gravity exists. Now here's a question. Where did the universe get its laws from? Why does it follow any rules at all? Stephen Hawking once said that the universe can and will create itself from nothing because of the law of gravity. But that's like saying, because of the rules of chess, a chessboard created itself. It's nonsense. Laws don't create anything. They require something else to act on. Even atheists like Lawrence Krauss, who wrote A Universe from Nothing, admit that the nothing they talk about isn't really nothing. It's a quantum vacuum, a field full of energy, governed by laws of physics. That's something, not nothing. So we're back to the same question. Where did the quantum field come from? Where did its laws come from? The idea of God answers a question that science cannot. Not how things happen, but why there is a universe at all. Now, let's return to the question, who created God? This question only makes sense if God is just another thing inside the universe, like a planet or a person or a particle. But that's not what God is. God is not in time or space. God created time and space. So asking who created God is like asking, what came before time? The question breaks down. God is outside time. He doesn't begin to exist. He just is. This might sound abstract, but it's actually not that hard to grasp. Let me give you an analogy. Imagine you're watching a movie. You see scenes play out one after the other. For the characters in the movie, time is passing. But the director of the movie, the one who made it, is outside of that timeline. He's not bound by it. He can rewind, fast forward, pause. The entire timeline is in front of him at once. In the same way, God is outside of the timeline of the universe. He's not bound by it. So asking who created God is like a character in a novel asking who created the author inside the story. It just doesn't work that way. Now, some atheists might say, but if you say God doesn't need a cause, why not just say the universe doesn't need a cause? Good question. Here's the difference. The universe is made of matter and energy. It changes. It expands. It ages. That means it's contingent. It doesn't have to exist. It could have been different. It could have not existed at all. Whatever begins to exist and whatever is contingent needs a cause, but God, by definition, is necessary. He doesn't begin. He doesn't change. He doesn't depend on anything. That's why he doesn't need a cause. And by the way, this isn't just religious talk. These are philosophical arguments that go back thousands of years, from Aristotle to Aquinas to modern thinkers. Even atheist philosophers like Bertrand Russell admitted they couldn't fully answer why there is something rather than nothing. They simply said, the universe is just there, and that's all. But that's not an explanation. It's just a way of avoiding the question. Now let's look at real life. When we see design, we assume a designer. If you walked through a forest and found a watch on the ground, you wouldn't say, wow, look what the wind made. You'd know immediately that it was designed, because it has structure, purpose, and complexity. The universe is far more complex than a watch. The fine-tuning of the universe is one of the most powerful arguments for God. If the force of gravity were just a tiny bit stronger or weaker, stars couldn't form. If the expansion rate of the universe had been just a fraction off in the first second of the Big Bang, the universe would have collapsed or expanded too fast for galaxies to form. These are not made-up numbers. These are calculations made by physicists. So how do atheists explain this? Some say, maybe there are infinite universes, and we just happen to be in the one that works. But that's not science. That's speculation. It's like saying, maybe I won the lottery because there are infinite people playing. Sure, it's possible. But the simplest explanation is that it was designed that way. You don't need to believe in a specific religion to see the logic here. The question of God is separate from the question of religion. Before you get to scriptures or prophets or religious rules, the first question is, does a creator exist? And when you look at the facts, the logic, and the reality we live in, the answer points clearly toward a yes. Dr. Zakir Naik once responded to this very question. Someone asked him, if God created everything, then who created God? And he said, if a person claims there is no God because he wants to ask who created God, then the definition of God itself becomes meaningless. Because the moment you say God was created, he's no longer God. The true definition of God is someone who is eternal, who has no beginning, no end. If he had a beginning, he would need a creator, and that creator would be God. So you've just replaced one God with another. At some point, you have to stop the chain. You have to arrive at a first uncaused cause. That's what we call God. Some atheists may still feel unsatisfied. They may say, well, I don't feel like that answers everything. But feelings are not facts. Truth doesn't depend on how comfortable it makes us. Many scientific facts are uncomfortable, like gravity. You may not feel like falling, but if you jump off a building, gravity doesn't care. In the same way, whether or not the idea of God is satisfying emotionally, it may still be true logically. So next time you hear someone say, who created God? Remember that the question is based on a misunderstanding. It assumes that God is just a bigger version of us, something that came into being and needs an explanation. But the real God, the one described in classical theism and philosophy, is beyond time, beyond space, and beyond causation. He didn't begin. He doesn't depend. He simply is. And without that kind of being, nothing else makes sense. We don't say this to force belief, but to invite thought. If you're an atheist or agnostic, don't settle for surface-level slogans. Dig deeper. Ask harder questions, not just about religion, but about existence itself. Because the truth is worth finding, even if it leads you somewhere unexpected.